Hi, good afternoon. This is Dr. Sam Sunshine at OC Sports and Wellness, and I have the pleasure of having a wonderful guest today. So for those of you who are listening live, this is going to be a treat, especially if you're an athlete and you are currently competing and nutrition matters to you. So my guest today is Anthony Almada, and because he has somewhat of a complicated intro, I'm going to have him introduce himself. And then if you are listening, if you don't mind putting your name and where you're from into the comment box, that would be helpful. So without further ado, Anthony, again, welcome. It's great to have you here. I've known you for a long time, and it's really a pleasure. The shirt, although I wish... Anyway, so yeah, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and a little bit about your background would be great.
Sure. Well, thank you, Sam, Dr. Sunshine, and hi, everyone. I met Sam actually at Berkeley when I was in, I think, my first year of grad school there, and I think we met in the gym. And Sam was doing clinical nutrition research related to metabolism and absorption in the intestines with a very famous researcher named Norman Kretschmer. And we became friends, and then it turns out that we happened to be living in the same city again down in Southern California, and here I am. I've worked in the nutrition industry since 1975. I was co-founder of a company that pioneered an ingredient called creatine back in 1993, and that became a very big company. And the premise of that company and my career is built beyond that since then on proving that an ingredient or product works in humans by doing studies in humans. So my orientation is very evidence-based. And if there are no studies to support something working, it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It doesn't mean that it's unsafe. It just lacks proof. And it becomes more of an evangelical promise rather than an evidence-based, fact-based purchase or practice or discipline.
So I would say, kind of continuing that thought, Anthony has been a great resource for me when I think I've come across some new product that has promise, oftentimes going back to the basics and realizing there's no evidence behind it, and it's mostly just myth and mythology. So today's topic is going to be about proteins, dietary proteins in particular, and I'm going to ask Anthony a series of questions and have him illuminate us and maybe highlight some kind of key points that a lot of people ask me on a regular basis. So the first question is, what is dietary protein and why do we need it?
Well, I like to use the metaphorical description of protein as being a pearl necklace. And each pearl that comprises proteins that our bodies make and that we find in foods and that are all around us in plants, in probiotic bacteria. All the microorganisms make their own protein, and each individual pearl is different. And there are about 22 amino acids, and our bodies can make most of them, but there are several that we can't, or we can't make enough of them. And so there is an absolute need for these so-called essential or conditional amino acids to be provided from the diet because our bodies can't make enough. And there's emerging research that the bacteria or the microbes in our gut can make protein, but not enough to survive. And so there's an essential component that describes protein, and that essentiality is defined by the composition or what pearls make up that protein. And each dietary source of protein has a different arrangement and different ratios of pearls. So you may find some proteins, for example, that are derived from terrestrial animals or animals, mammals, birds, fish, that have a very different profile of pearls or amino acids, as they're called. Each individual pearl is referred to as an amino acid. And plant proteins have different ratios and different compositions. And those can influence how well they're digested and absorbed and how well they are used.
Great. Okay, so again, there are basically three macronutrients, the fats, proteins, and carbs. Again, we ingest proteins. Those get broken down into amino acids. Some we need that are essential, meaning our bodies don't make them. Kind of like we have essential fats. We don't have any essential carbs, though. Our body, so we don't need to have dietary carbs, essentially, or the ones that are essential. But there's essential
not yet.
proteins or amino
Correct.
acids and essential fats. All right. So I hear and read a lot about different proteins. You kind of talked about plant proteins. We have algae proteins, engineered proteins. And we kind of talked a little bit about that, like the Beyond Meat, Beyond Meat burger. A lot of you, I'm sure, out there have tried that. Free range versus grass-fed animal proteins. Are all these the same, or are they all different?
They are indeed all different, and that difference, as I just mentioned, relates to the ratios and the amounts of each of the individual amino acids or pearls that comprise that protein chain. And proteins that you find in the diet can be a chain of hundreds of amino acids, and how you prepare them can influence them. One of the really interesting myths that exists, and it always requires, or it often can be answered by a common sense question. One of the statements that I've seen and heard for decades now has been that if you cook a protein, you so-called denature it, which means you change its shape. And the best example of a protein being denatured is taking an egg white, which is kind of clear, light gold, and throwing it onto a hot cooking surface, and within seconds it will turn white. It's the same composition of pearls, but the heat changes the shape from a pearl that's knotted this way to one that's knotted that way, and that changes its color and its transparency to light. And that denaturing process also happens in your stomach when you expose it to the very potent acid in there. And so if denatured proteins were of no use, then you would find widespread protein malnutrition among anyone that ate only cooked proteins, and that just doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. In fact, one could assert that we are in a country or continent that overconsumes protein. That's a different discussion, but it's very, very rare to find protein malnutrition in North America or Europe.
Great point. So I wanted to say hello to Susie. She just chimed in.
Hi, Susie.
And great to have listeners.
Go Bears, Susie.
I know, we got to get that cow shirt off. That would make this episode inappropriate. Okay, so when we talk about digestion and absorption, again, we first got to eat it, and it's got to get broken up with the stomach acids and digestive enzymes. And then we have to absorb proteins across the brush border of our intestines. What are some highlights, and when can too much protein absorption be a bad thing?
Well, there's always that slippery slope that whatever you consume, even water that comes from Mount Olympus, if you consume too much of it, you will die. And every year there probably are a dozen or more people that engage in water drinking games on like a hot dog eating contest, where they see or determine who can drink the most water, and they'll be drinking tens of gallons. And invariably, somebody or several people die from that, from water, acute water intoxication. It's not because the water had impurities, it's just that there's too much in the body can't handle it, and it basically shuts down the part of the brain that regulates breathing, and they die, which most people have never even heard of. But in the context of protein digestion and absorption, the bad side is something that many people talk about, have tested, and I'm sure you have patients that are, I think they have a food allergy, is food allergies are almost always mediated by absorbing an intact protein or a large part of a protein, which is a pearl necklace, in a size that may be enough that would turn the immune system on, but not too small that the immune system would not recognize it. And so protein fragments, peanut, corn, fish, shellfish, gluten is a protein. That's an interesting discussion to ask people, what is gluten? Not that where does it come from, but what is it? It's a protein. It's a class of proteins. And proteins are the main mediator of food hypersensitivity or anaphylactic shock, severe allergic response, and even that manifest in hives or redness or itching of your mouth. All these things are protein human cell interaction mediated. So when we talk about protein digestion, we have to ask the question, if you're suspect of your inability and you've been led to believe that you need digestive enzymes, well, let's do a little bit of testing here and see indeed if you are protein malnourished, because the assumption would be if you're not absorbing the protein or digesting it and breaking it down so it could be absorbed in adequate quantities, then we should find breakdown products of excessive protein breakdown in your stool. We would find or expect to find low amounts of certain proteins in your blood that would indicate your body has an impaired ability to make some proteins. And these would be the albumin and globulin, what you would find in a blood test. So there are ways to determine if you're protein malnourished or if you're under absorbing protein. It's not very common, but it is one that it definitely is a topic of consideration. But it's very rare that a person has a problem in being grossly inadequate in digesting protein.
Okay. So yeah, so the absorption thing, it doesn't seem like many people have issues with that. Again, we check albumin and globulin in the metabolic panel, which is a compulsory test I do on anybody who comes in for blood work. And it is uncommon to see low protein levels. So that's a great point. So I have played with the macronutrients, the proteins, carbs, and fats, and the ratios in my diet. We talked a little bit about that. Back when maybe 10, 20 years ago, when we hear about the Kenyan runners and that their diets were 70% carbohydrate because they needed that. And so as an endurance athlete, you would think, okay, I should be doing that as well. And then kind of finding out.
Because you were kind of Kenyan.
Because I'm part Kenyan, and but really realizing maybe that wasn't necessarily the way to go. And again, we've gone through this vilification of fat for the past 40 years that now is being changed in the rhetoric. But I have a number of my patients that are athletes and non-athletes alike, and they describe protein as being this magical macronutrient that can help them with weight loss, can help them with performance, and that won't make you fat. That eating protein will not make you fat, and then it builds muscle. Can you kind of highlight a lot of things to think about or talk about? We do have plenty of time to go into each of these, but how magical of a macronutrient is protein, and maybe talking a little bit about whether or not it can make you fat and if it helps to build muscle.
Well, given that this is the era of gender neutrality and pronouns, I think it's important to still put in context, if you are biologically female, historically, females that are not athletes, and even some female athletes that I work with that are Olympian, they underconsume protein, especially if they're engaged in athletic training or competitive sports. And I think in my working with female researchers who have studied this in females, because typically in the world of research, it's not too often you find a male researcher or scientist or doctor doing studies in women. It's usually males doing studies mostly in men, and females doing studies mostly in women because of that gender inequity in relation to research, which is an unfortunate representation, and it's a very timely topic, but not for today. But it's very common for women to underconsume protein because they are often concerned about weight and body composition, and therefore they restrict their food intake, and they will choose foods that they believe will be filling, but not high in calories, salads, vegetables, etc. But these are often very low in protein, and the amount of protein that's added to the meal or the salad that accompanies that is sometimes just once or twice a day. And so when you get into that discussion and that whole area of how best to navigate the mythical magical protein, is that we need to ask the question, how much do we need? That's a double need. And that may be one of the questions that comes up further, but a very good and research or evidence-based number to look at is 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight.
Per pound or kilogram?
per pound.
Per pound. Okay.
It's about 1.4 per kilogram,
Okay.
or 1.7. So when you do the math, you don't typically eat that all in one sitting. That's per day. And then we ask the question, now, how much can I eat at one time, or should I eat? And that zero point 0.8 grams per day, I need to clarify, is for an athlete, a person that's engaging in intensive training, not just walking on the treadmill for 30 minutes, but they're running hard on the treadmill, or they're doing interval training, or they're doing triathlon training. Sam's a multi-time Ironman finisher, or they're involved in competitive sports, or swimming, or football, the real football, soccer, or American football, Stanford Cal, all those different types of resistance training or bodybuilding, weight training. All these increase the need to support the demands that that type of training puts upon the muscles and connective tissue, not just the muscles, but the joints and tendons and ligaments that are involved in being stretched and compressed. If one is not engaged in any type of intensive, rigorous physical activity, then it may be going down to 0.5 to 0.6 grams per day per pound of body weight. Now, then we get into the question of how much can or should I consume at one time? And a number of studies have been done ranging from 5 grams of protein to 90 grams of protein, 5 grams of whey protein, which is a fraction of milk protein from cows. It's also in camel and goat and in human milk. And then the other end of the spectrum is 90 grams of cooked hamburger meat. And the interesting discussion to have there is not how much can you digest and absorb. As we were talking about earlier, protein digestion is typically not a problem. In fact, the studies have shown that the more that you eat, the more that you are able to digest and absorb, as evidenced by how the amino acids, the individual components that make up protein, the pearls, increase in the blood. The higher the protein meal, the higher the amount that goes in the blood. And one thing that also happens when you have protein is that it raises a hormone that is overall quite friendly and helpful, but it's often maligned, and that protein is insulin, which is a protein hormone, not a steroid hormone, that's made by a certain fragment or section of cells in your pancreas. We have a little technical shift here in our screen. There we go. Hi, everyone, again. You were still there. And so what the amino acids that make up protein do, some of them, when they get absorbed into the blood, they'll knock on the door of the pancreas because they're going there from the intestines, being absorbed into blood, and the bloodstream will take it by the liver, by the pancreas, etc. And some of them, when they knock on the door of the pancreas, they tell the pancreas, oh, wow, we got amino acids here, release insulin to blood. And that's the body's most potent muscle protein breakdown brake, B-R-A-K-E, or antagonist. It stops muscle protein from breaking down better than anything else in the human body. It is an anti-catabolic or anti-muscle protein breakdown hormone. It serves a significant purpose. It also, through that, helps build muscle. And even if you're not engaged in training, one of the things that you really want to protect, in addition to bone mass as you're aging, is muscle mass. And muscle that's strong and that's functional is associated with a higher quality of life. There's a whole realm of research going on something called sarcopenia, the loss of muscle mass over time. And where people say I'm 60 and I'm weigh the same that I did when I was at my high school prom, but you are not the same body composition. You don't have the same percent fat and muscle. You probably have the same weight, but you have a lot less protein or muscle and a lot more fat. So, and we get into that discussion, the dose that humans, male and female adults, and independent of body weight, of protein that they can use at any one time is about 20 grams. That's about a chicken breast. And if you have rice with that chicken breast, and you have an egg-based sauce or any protein sauce with that, you now maybe have a 30 gram protein meal. Those other grams above the 20 grams of protein, three things happen to them that have nothing to do with supporting body protein. they get burned for energy, they get converted into carbohydrate, or they get metabolized and you lose the breakdown products in the urine. All three happen at the same time. So protein, which is your most expensive macronutrient, becomes an energy source and it's wasted. It's not being used the way that you happen to want to use it. So it now becomes an additional calorie source that goes beyond the scope of being a protein source as intended.
So that's, touching upon the sarcopenia, again, maintaining lean body mass through age. I think that's, again, body composition testing is something we offer in our practice, and it's great to get. We generally lose about 1% per year after age 25, I've heard.
Speak for yourself.
If you don't use it, yeah. And so one guy was lecturing and he said, once you lose 40% of your lean body mass, you die. So that's if you do nothing between 25 and 65 without trying to maintain that lean body mass. Sayonara. So super important to maintain lean body mass. So that's really good. So again, kind of summarizing what Anthony was just talking about was proteins do stimulate insulin release by the pancreas. Most people think it's just the carbs that do, but proteins do as well, and that insulin release kind of halts the protein breakdown. And that and then there's a fixed amount that anybody can use at any one time, and that's about 20 grams.
And that's
of
in a
protein
qualified
in
a meal, in a
meal.
single time. And that comes from all sources, not just a concentrated protein like a piece of tofu or a pea protein shake. It comes from any other source of protein. It's the total protein. But the important qualifier there is for people that are not engaged in training, or if they haven't worked out within a few hours of that meal. Now, if they have worked out, 20 grams again, if you go and do a leg workout, or you run, do sprints on a bike or cycling sprints, and then you want to refuel and recover, more than 20 grams in that context still is wasted. However, if you did a multiple body part exercise where you swam and you ran, or you trained your legs and you did something for your chest or your shoulders or your arms, you now are doing multiple body parts, it's 40 grams. So the signals are, and the demand is greater or doubled in, again, probably independent of body weight when you do multiple body parts and you train them hard.
That's 40 grams in that meal.
Right, in the meal that follows your training bout.
So this is gospel. This is unbelievable information that we're getting here from Anthony, and I would challenge anybody to challenge his comments here today. So
but
it's really impressive.
I would offer this one thing, Sam, and it's not me. It's just reading scientists that some of my friends and colleagues have undertaken that are brilliant scientists. But is we've heard this discussion about when's the best time to eat after working out, and we hear this window of opportunity, the 2 hours, and if you can, refuel right after. But a very interesting area of research has been emerging over the past several years, and it's showing that going back to digestion and absorption, in the immediate 30 plus or so minutes that follow exercise from cycling, running, or resistance training, our intestines are not very well suited to digest and absorb protein or carbs. It's impaired. And you will see the amount that's absorbed is reduced. So I tell people, don't do it right after, wait 30 minutes. And a lot of people say, no, I'm not hungry right after I work out. So I say,
probably a reason for that.
Perhaps. It's your body now I know what my body's telling me that. So maybe 35, 40 minutes, that's when you want to consume that protein and carbs, whatever ratio you want, or just your protein, or just carbs right after you train to get the most into your body. Because again, it's not what you eat, it's what you absorb and can utilize.
Okay, great. So this is great information for athletes and non-athletes alike in terms of protein needs and protein consumption, timing of protein ingestion. I'd like to open up to anybody who's listening to ask a question to Anthony. Again, I know this is noontime on a Thursday. I'm hoping this is a time where people can jump on a Facebook Live. Having a guest like Anthony is a rarity, so I'm super excited you're here, and I'm hoping people ask some questions. If not, I've got another question. In the athletes that are also patients of mine, we talked about how much protein do we need. And then for patients who want to lose fat, is there a certain amount of protein that we want to make sure we get or not overconsume? And you may have answered that already, but maybe you can address that. If you wanted to lose weight, which is probably a bigger concern for more of my patients, and athletes included, do you have any comments about that?
Definitely. And I know, and we've talked about this before, Sam, but the issue that is probably most prominent and prevalent in your practice and many medical practices, even though you're a sports medicine doctor and a competitive athlete, is the concern about body composition, body weight. And I think it's important, as you stated, that we focus on body fat, because body weight doesn't really tell you what's happening to the components that make up body weight, especially bone. And one of the things that happens with dieting is that you can lose bone mass, and that's not good. And losing muscle mass is not good. And so and this is a question that is a very sensitive one, because there are so many different camps as to no carb, low carb, keto, paleo, intermittent fasting, etc. But if you think about how people eat, the best way to do a study to determine the influence of a macro profile, percent carbs, fat, and protein, is to put people into what's called a metabolic chamber or ward, where they live in effectively a metabolic prison where they can't leave. It's a significant commitment, and they're there for weeks.
So we're currently recruiting people. No, I'm just kidding. But this is uncommon, although there's such a place at Cal.
At Berkeley, they did a lot of these studies in the so-called penthouse of the Nutrition and Sciences Department. And some have been done at the National Institutes of Health in England. But a most recent study, which is really interesting, that it was funded by a gentleman who's a New York Times writer named Gary Taubes, who's a vocal supporter and advocate of low-carb diets. He's written books, he's been interviewed many, many times, and he is part of a nonprofit foundation that funded the study that was done with the National Institutes of Health. And they took people that were moderately obese, and they, at 2 different 4-week periods of time, they gave them the exact amount of calories. The only thing that changed between each of those 2 4-week intervals was the percent carbs and protein. The fat percent was identical both times. Calories were identical. They had them in this chamber where it could measure their calorie burning by the heat that evolved from the body, not by breathing in something which is indirect. And they saw exactly how much they ate. The problem that comes up with studies where they look at the influence of a diet is that if they're so-called free living or outpatient, who's going to report, oh yeah, I had a Snickers bar, don't tell Dr. Sunshine, because he won't think positively of me. And also some studies that have been going on now for 2 or 3 decades, even published in the New England Journal of Medicine, have shown that people unintentionally underreport their calories by 20 or 25%. So you don't know. And people do it unintentionally. So if they're in this metabolic prison, you know exactly what they eat, and they push the tray through. Oh, you have 2 pieces or 2 bites of string beans left. Subtract those from your calorie intake. Just because they were on the plate doesn't mean they were consumed. And when that study was done, the results completely went against what was expected by the group that founded it. They showed that irrespective of the type of diet, high carb or high protein, same fat, same calories. I'm sorry, it was protein, forgive me, it was carbs and fat that varied, not protein. Protein was identical. Calories were identical. They just adjusted the carbon and fat concentration. That in each 4-week interval, there was no difference in the change in body composition. None. No difference. So everything continues to point to, in the most rigorously controlled studies, that when people have their calories monitored and their protein is held the same, there's no difference. It's calories that predict and that are most influential, which may be hard for people to hear because, oh, I've had great success with my low protein or my low carb diet. Well, what happens though is that people typically are more active and they underconsume when they don't think they're underconsuming. But I would say that the overarching topic, and we've talked about this numerous times, is that each person's metabolism is different. Their gut microbiome is different. Their aversion to foods are different. Their preferences for food. And so people need to experiment in the hands of someone like Dr. Sunshine to help them guide, and Steve Holmes, a clinical nutritionist here, guide the type of diet that works best with that person, and any other supplements or perhaps meds that they're on, or even any changes in their gut microbiome with an appropriate probiotic or prebiotic or symbiotic, both of them together. All those can influence how you respond to calories and how your body composition changes or stays the same.
That's great. So I'd like to kind of tie everything together. Maybe if you can have, we're kind of at the end of our half hour here, but tying together, all the points that you've made, if you have maybe a take-home message, again, specifically for protein, and then to tell the audience if there's areas of nutrition that you would like to, maybe I could bring Anthony back in the future for maybe other topics. I know there's so many great topics, looking at different diets, looking at different supplements. Please let us know. But if you can summarize today's discussion, maybe in a few bullet points, like what are the salient things that you want people to leave today with, knowing that I think will have the most impact for them?
Sure. Well, protein is essential. Find proteins that agree with your tummy, with your skin. Skin is often a very frequent manifestation of a food reaction, where you don't have any upset, you don't have bloating, you don't experience constipation, you don't have a skin reaction, you don't have an itchy roof through your mouth. All these things are important. You don't have gas. 2 is that target for about 0.5 to 0.6 grams of protein per day per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you're talking there about 100 to 120 grams per day. If you are a person who's engaged, and that's for a sedentary person, if you are engaging in vigorous physical activity, go for about 0.8. That's if you're eating enough calories. Now, if you are under eating calories because you want to reduce your body fat and your body weight, then you would be wise to increase your protein intake, because it may be helpful to you, and it's been shown in a number of different studies, that if you're reducing your carbohydrate intake, which is a common practice for reducing body fat and weight, it would be good to offset that by having more protein. And then, under the guidance of Dr. Sunshine and his staff, choosing the right macro ratios. If you are engaging in intense physical activity, we're going here for about 0.8, and then being mindful of, after intense training, in that meal that follows a training, maybe wait a half an hour or so and shoot for, if you worked out multiple body parts, however you trained, shoot for 40 grams if you're a man or a woman, male or female, irrespective of the type of training you're doing. That's the one meal where your body would respond well and your muscles would respond well to 40 grams of protein where it's warranted, where you've earned it. Other than that, it's about 20 grams per day. Now, if you weigh 260 pounds and you're lean, you now have to consume more protein at each meal because you just can't get enough if you're aiming for 20 grams every 3 hours. That's another element. How often? About 3 to 3.5, 4 hours. And then if you are aiming to change your body composition, be mindful that ratios are very individual specific. If you drop carbohydrates significantly, it can have a significant impact upon your cognitive function, your mood, and you may make people around you spread, not because of COVID, but because they don't want to be around you because you're irritable. And so be mindful of the influence of carbohydrate on behavior and mood and cognitive function. And some people can adapt within a week and feel great on 25, 40, 50, 60 grams, 80 grams of carbohydrates a day. Others have a horrible time. Each individual responds differently.
So that'll be our next talk, is carbs.
Okay. Let's do it.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming and tuning in and listening to us. Again, I want to thank Anthony for coming over and sharing his knowledge. It's been great. I want to thank you.
Thank you for the privilege.
Because this was really an amazing amount of really important information that you can't find just anywhere. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll be here again next Thursday.
Stay safe and healthy.